In a study in Oslo, Norway, hangs a yellowed sample of a passport with its official stamps long faded and blurry. Yet for millions of exiles in the 1920s, this single piece of paper was their only proof of existence in the world. And the man who issued it had been publicly presumed dead, buried beneath the eternal ice sheet of the Arctic only a few years prior. Fridtjof Nansen. His name belonged both to a man who endured 3 years trapped in the frozen wasteland and to a sage who wielded influence across diplomatic halls in Geneva. Tonight, by the soft glow of flickering firelight, and a story meant to be felt rather than memorized, let us walk into the true life of this extraordinary man. Few can live such a divided existence, spending the first half of life challenging the limits of nature with their own flesh, and the second half defying the indifference of politics with their reputation. He once deliberately let his ship become locked in sea ice, drifting with the current for 3 years to test a wild scientific hypothesis. He also stood amid famine and plague-stricken foreign lands, raising his hoarse voice to beg the world for a ration called compassion. Extreme solitude and overwhelming worldly chaos merged strangely within him. In tonight's tale, we shall cross the auroras of the Arctic and gaze deep into the glaciers and flames hidden within this man's soul. It was the summer of 1893, and the harbor of Christiania, Norway, was packed with crowds seeing them off, filled with a tangled mix of unease and admiration. In his early 30s, Fridtjof Nansen stood on the deck of the Fram, a peculiarly built wooden vessel with a hull rounded like half a coconut shell. All leading navigational authorities mocked Nansen as a suicidal fool, for his plans sounded utterly absurd. Instead of avoiding the jagged ice floes capable of crushing steel, he intended to sail straight into the ice zone and let his ship freeze solid. Nansen firmly believed in the existence of Arctic Ocean currents, convinced the ice would carry his vessel across the North Pole. As the ship slowly sailed out of the harbor, Nansen glanced back at the fading city. He knew this departure might be forever. He wrote in his diary, "I have burned all my bridges. From now on, the drifting ice sea shall be my home." As winter came, the sea's surface heaved violently, and massive ice ridges gnawed at the hull like giant teeth, emitting an eerie metallic groan. The crew huddled together through the endless polar night, listening to the ice roar mere centimeters beyond the cabin walls, while Nansen calmly measured ice thickness. This quiet surrender to the whims of nature marked the first great gamble of Nansen's life. Trapped amid the ice year after year, the Fram drifted at a maddeningly slow pace. Late one night, Nansen suddenly realized the currents might carry the ship but would never deliver him to the geographic North Pole. In the spring of 1895, he made an even more reckless decision. Leaving the warmth of the cabin, he set out on foot for the pole alongside his companion Johansen, with sleds and dog teams in tow. They ventured into a forbidden land no human had ever set foot upon. Temperatures plummeted to 50 degrees below zero, with every breath instantly freezing into heavy icicles on their beards. They climbed jagged ice ridges each day, sometimes advancing only a few kilometers while exhausting immense strength. By April, Nansen discovered the floes were drifting south far too quickly. After trekking north all day, their coordinates were actually slipping backward. Even the resolute Nansen felt the bitter mockery of fate. He chose to turn back, seeking shelter for the winter on the remote Franz Josef Land archipelago. Supplies ran low, and they slaughtered the last of their sled dogs. Tormented by hunger and bitter cold, they dug a crude stone cave and survived by hunting walruses like primitive men. For 9 long months, Nansen and Johansen huddled inside that dark, smoke-filled stone hut, sharing one sleeping bag for warmth. It was the closest he ever came to death. Every cell in his body screamed in agony, yet his gaze turned as cold and unyielding as ice through the endless polar night. When the world believed Nansen had perished and turned to bones on the ice wilderness, he miraculously emerged at the camp of a party of British explorers in the summer of 1896. Disheveled and darkened by walrus oil smoke, he politely tipped his tattered hat and asked, "I presume you are Mr. Jackson?" Nansen's homecoming plunged all of Norway into celebration. He became a national hero and an icon of scientific achievement. Yet at the height of his fame, as the smoke of World War I shrouded Europe, Nansen was overcome by a strange emptiness. He came to see that the bitter cold of humanity, born of hatred, greed, and indifference, was far harder to endure than the pure frigid wilderness of the Arctic. When the war ended, Europe was left with millions of refugees. Stateless and stripped of dignity, They were tossed aside like unwanted burdens by newly formed nations. In 1921, the League of Nations turned to Nansen. They hoped to use the Arctic hero's prestige to handle a crisis no other diplomat dared to touch. Nansen hesitated. Already in his 60s, he could have enjoyed a quiet retirement in academia or continued his marine biology research. But when he saw photographs of children freezing to death along borderlines, their eyes reminded him of the despairing winter he had endured on Franz Josef Land. He accepted the appointment. This time, his vessel was no wooden ship, but his own unshakable reputation. In the diplomatic wilderness, Nansen faced resistance fiercer than any Arctic blizzard. While seasoned diplomats clung to political bargaining and rigid formalities, Nansen charged in like a bold Nordic outsider, demanding nations open their borders without compromise. To solve the crisis of refugees lacking legal identity and the right to travel, he created a stroke of legal genius, the Nansen Passport. This simple sheet of paper, endorsed directly by the League of Nations, bore no allegiance to any sovereign state yet represented the most basic right of human survival. It granted displaced Russian nobles and homeless Armenian orphans a chance to start their lives anew. Among those saved were the famed painter Marc Chagall and Vladimir Nabokov, later author of Lolita. To raise relief funds, Nansen traveled the globe giving lectures, humble as a beggar pleading for aid. He once stood before grand assemblies, slamming his fist on the table amid elegantly dressed politicians. "You debate budget figures in this hall, while 5 million people outside starve so desperately they resort to eating corpses." His pure humanity rose above politics and national borders, making him a striking, radiant figure in an era dominated by selfish gain. He did not merely save lives. Amid the spiritual ruins of post-war Europe, he restored humanity's fading faith and kindness. In 1922, the Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to Fridtjof Nansen, perhaps the most well-deserved honor in the prize's history. Nansen donated all his prize money to relief work, remaining modestly settled in his simple Norwegian home with a life of humble restraint. People asked what drove him to keep acting with such relentless resolve after surviving countless brushes with death. Nansen replied, "I learned one thing on the ice. If you stop moving, you freeze to death." In his later photographs, the once hardened adventurer bore a heartbreaking compassion in his eyes. Years of Arctic expeditions had left him with severe chronic illness, yet he continued campaigning to ease famine in Soviet Russia and oversee population exchanges between Greece and Turkey. No longer merely a scientist studying ocean currents and wind patterns, he became an elderly man bearing the world's suffering upon his shoulders. One quiet afternoon in 1930, Nansen sat on his balcony and closed his eyes forever in the warm sunlight. Flags across Norway flew at half-mast, and silent, spontaneous mourning spread through refugee camps worldwide. He walked forth from the frozen ice, and finally melted into the warmest emotions of humanity. Looking back on Fridtjof Nansen's life, one profound puzzle emerges. His greatest scientific expedition never actually reached the North Pole, a technical failure by all standards. Yet with the perseverance forged through that failure, he achieved an unrivaled spiritual summit. The Nansen Passport has long faded into history, yet his spirit lingers wherever humanitarian aid is needed today. He proved that even in the coldest, barrenest and most hopeless corners of the world, one person's will and compassion can shine like the aurora across the long night. In this noisy, restless age, Nansen's story helps us find inner steadiness once more. Do not fear drifting with the current. If your heart remains resolute, life's tides will always carry you toward distant light. And so our tale ends tonight. The fire dims, and may you fall peacefully asleep beneath the same starry sky Nansen once gazed upon. The world may be cold, but you are never alone. Good night.